Good afternoon. I'm Dick Kell, the chair of the Warren Centre Humanitarian Engineering Hub, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where each of us is located for the meeting, for the webinar, wherever that may be within our nation or in neighbouring countries. And we pay our respects to First Nations peoples and their leaders past and present, and recognise and celebrate their history and culture and achievements. I welcome you to this webinar, which has been organised by the Humanitarian Engineering Hub. The Hub was established to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas and experiences and the promotion of humanitarian engineering within the context of international development and disaster response and relief. You are most welcome to join the Hub, become a member. There is no charge. A link will be provided at the end of this webinar. The rules for the webinar, very simple. I'll just remind you that the event is being recorded, and our schedule has time for questions and responses. Please make use of the Q&A function to pose your questions, and our panellists will address as many as they can at the end of their presentations. Please identify yourself and keep your question or comment as concise as possible. Our webinar today is on the critical issue of emergency warning systems or anticipatory action plans designed to keep communities in Pacific Island countries safe, or at least at less risk when natural disasters occur. And disasters, of course, can occur from many diverse forms, from cyclones, from torrential rain causing flooding, from drought at the other end of the spectrum, from heat, from seismic events, volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and tsunamis. But we have been able to bring together a panel of three outstanding practitioners, each from a different background, but each a leader in her or his field. I will turn over to our panel moderator, Paul McCann, who will introduce our panel and get the show on the road. Paul is a member of the Hub Committee. He has had over 40 years in network planning and development in the telecommunications industry, internationally and domestically, including with major companies Verizon and Telstra, and is now involved in development of satellites and submarine cables with a focus on Pacific Island countries. So, Paul, it's over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dick, and welcome everybody to today's seminar. As Dick has alluded to, we have a great panel of people lined up for us this afternoon, and first of all, we all thank you for joining. If you have questions, please put them into the appropriate area on the Zoom, and they will be addressed at the end of the three sessions that we're going to present. So today we have, as Dick indicated, three speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Nandini Ramesh. She's a senior research scientist with CSIRO in Australia and an expert in the physics of large-scale tropical climate phenomena, particularly in the Pacific. So thank you, Nandini. Our next speaker is based in the USA at the present stage. His name is Keith Bettinger, a climate specialist with just finishing up some work that was done in some Vanuatu to do with the Fragile Waters Project. And our third speaker is Peter Self, a CEO and founder of Broadwick Connect and the CEO of EWS, a company which works internationally providing advice and installation for emergency warning systems. So It's with great pleasure that I will now hand over to Nandini to commence the first session. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I work at the CSIRO, which, for those of you that don't know, is Australia's national science agency. And we, my colleagues and myself, work closely with a number of organizations across the Pacific region to help bolster resilience, help understand what the threats are around climate change in the future. And so I'll be presenting on sort of a general view of what types of threats climate change poses in the region, and might give you a small example towards the end of things we can actually do about it. So to begin, I'll set the stage, sort of describing the region that we're interested in. And the bulk of my presentation is going to be about how climate change can amplify or exacerbate the types of natural hazards that already occur in the region. And then at the end, I'll just give you a quick summary. So the region we're interested in is a place with a tropical and subtropical climate. So there are some obvious things that come from that, like you expect it to be warm and humid in such places. And that means that we are at essentially the boundary of what the human body has evolved to tolerate, and heat waves can be quite deadly when they do occur in that setting. Another characteristic of tropical and subtropical climates is that rainfall tends to be organized in these large band-like structures. So there are these two blue bands you can see in the picture in front of you. One's known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, and the other is the South Pacific Convergence Zone. And these are features of the Earth's large-scale circulation that bring moisture into those areas and cause rainfall. These features shift around and change shape as well over the course of the seasons. So typically, at any given location, you get the majority of your annual rainfall when one of these features is above you in the atmosphere. What this means is that most of these places are, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt to say I have a message saying someone is not able to see the slides.
Correct, Nandini. Could you reset that and share your slides again, please?
Yes, okay. There we go. Are you able to see slides now?
We can, yes.
Yes, okay, so I'll resume from where I was. So the features I was speaking about are these large blue areas on the map where the atmospheric circulation converges moisture into them, and that causes precipitation over the areas beneath. What this means is that if you are at a particular location in the Pacific, most of your annual rainfall occurs when this feature is above you in the atmosphere. That means that in a lot of places, something like 75% of the annual rain happens in a matter of 3 months. And if for some reason there's a change to that pattern, you could end up being left high and dry. So you're going to have a full 9 months with no rainfall. And if you didn't stock up on water beforehand, you're going to have issues with drought. Rainfall in these regions comes from convective storms, which are these high energy thunderstorms that mean rain rates can be very high and therefore damaging. And of course, associated with that, you get tropical cyclones, which can also bring damaging winds, storm surge. You know all about that. Now, the setting where all of this happens is quite diverse geomorphologically. And this means that you need solutions to be quite tailored because the consequences of the same storm surge are going to look quite different in these different settings. You have low-lying atolls, which are very threatened by rising waters, but you also do have high rugged mountains, some of which get high enough to get the occasional dusting of snow. So a very wide variety of landscapes, and tailored solutions are quite critical to getting that, getting things right in this area. So before I jump in, I'd like to go over.
Nandini, just one more interrupt. I'm sorry. Could you please put your slides onto a presenter view? Not on presenter view.
Oh, I see.
Put them on
I'm
the
so
full
sorry.
screen. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thanks for letting me know. Is this working now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what we do to study climate change. Now, of course, we observe the Earth system very closely. We've got satellites, weather stations, networks of buoys and moorings in the ocean measuring things like temperatures and velocities. At the same time, we use a lot of physical knowledge. So we have physics-based simulators, which we call climate models. And these are quite similar to weather models, but at a much larger scale and simulating the entire Earth. So these are the type of models that give us estimates of things like whether we're going to keep to the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees C warming. And they tell us things like what we see in the first graph under different scenarios with different amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, how much warming can we expect? But they actually also are, under the hood, spatially resolving all the changes that are happening in the atmosphere and the ocean under those conditions. So they're on a grid, like the picture on the left, and the output on the right is actually from one of these models. So you get these swirling motions as you expect in the atmosphere. And modeling centers around the world coordinate these experiments. So over the course of this presentation, I'm going to show you a few outputs from these models designed around the world. So the way that climate change interacts with the natural disasters that are of relevance to the Pacific are the following. The first is the most obvious, which is that temperatures will increase, and that has consequences. The second is that an increased temperature means that the atmosphere holds more water, and so it's also more humid. The third is sea level rise, which you've all heard about. And the fourth, which is probably the most uncertain and complex, is that the timing and location of rainfall and storms can be changed because the atmospheric circulation is changed. So those bands of rainfall might change location, but also things like tropical cyclones might change where they occur. So starting with the first and most obvious one, as the temperature increases, in the tropical belt, we are already in a zone which is very humid and very close to the limit of what human bodies tolerate. We cool ourselves by sweating, and that sweat has to evaporate to cool us. And when it's very humid, our bodies have trouble doing that. The sweat doesn't evaporate, and you just end up losing water, but still heating. In the Pacific region, we have a bit of a perfect storm because we are in a setting where there are aging populations, and also there's a lot of outdoor labor. The agricultural industry in particular has this issue because a lot of agriculture in the region is not mechanized and relies on manual labor. And it can have effects like heat stroke and kidney damage. And that's particularly risky in populations that have high rates of non-communicable diseases like diabetes. So heat waves are a little bit of a silent killer because in the tropics, people tend to think, well, we're already used to the heat. But the fact that we're pushing it that little bit more means that it becomes quite dangerous. A warmer atmosphere also holds more moisture. So for every degree of warming, the air holds 7% more water vapor. What that means is that this is exponential and it will only become more rapid as the atmosphere warms. This means there's more vapor in the air that can then condense, form clouds, and fall out as rain. So you get higher rain rates. And compounding that, you also have the fact that convective storms rely on that energy of condensation to have high wind speeds and be as powerful as they are. So you're making it rainier and you're making the winds faster. These maps are simulations from those global climate models. And everywhere that's green on these maps is expected to experience an increase in their maximum rainfall rates. So this is almost a universal phenomenon. And the places that are hatched where it doesn't disagree, there's higher uncertainty, but you can see that over most of the Pacific, there's a pretty significant intensification of rainfall. And intensifying your rain rate means you end up with impacts like flash flooding or landslides that are exacerbated by the larger amount of water falling. Sea level rise is also a threat that's associated with climate change, and it's particularly a threat in the West Pacific. So sea level is not uniform around the world. It's a little bit higher in some places and a little bit lower in others. And on this map is the trend in sea level, meaning the amount of sea level rise that we've observed from satellites looking down at the Earth. This one is from the European Space Agency. And in these areas that are sort of reddish orange, we've seen about 10 to 15 centimeters of sea level rise already. The reason this varies spatially is that it also has to do with the temperature of the water. So when water is warmer, it expands. And this means that you get uneven expansion because the temperature of the water is uneven. And then the winds can actually maintain that gradient instead of allowing the water to seek its own level. So much of the West Pacific is in that area where the winds are bringing warm surface waters together. And that means that their sea level rise is happening faster than everybody else's. Now, tropical cyclones are one of the major threats in the region and sort of bring together many of the things we've seen. So we've seen that sea level is rising, and that means that storm surge caused by tropical cyclones can be worse. I was telling you that rain rates and wind speeds are going to be higher, and tropical cyclones do a lot of their damage through those. So this is something that's expected to intensify over time. The northwestern sector of the Pacific is the part of the world with the most tropical cyclone activity. So what I'm showing you on this map here is all of the trajectories of tropical cyclones over a 50-year period, with the colors showing the intensity. So the bright red shade shows every Category 5 cyclone, and you can see how concentrated they are in that region sort of off the Philippines. There's also a region that gets hardly any tropical cyclone activity along the equator and in the Eastern Pacific. So there are some places where this is not a threat, but for much of the tropical Pacific, this is the main climate-related hazard. Now, one small mercy is that they're expected to become less frequent. Most climate modeling agrees that tropical cyclones overall will become less frequent. But however, when they do form, they're going to be more intense. The map on the right is showing a little bar of the predictions from various climate models of 4 things. The first is how frequent they'll be, and you'll see that the percent change is negative in all of those. The second shows how many Category 4 and 5 cyclones there will be, and that is a bit more variable. The third bar shows the intensity measured by wind speed, and that increases in most regions. And across the board, the rain rate carried by these tropical cyclones also increases. So I should add that not only are they bringing more water when they rain, they also have started to move more slowly. So the classic example of this was Hurricane Harvey in Texas, where the storm just sat over the city of Houston for a long time, meaning that the rainfall that would have otherwise been spread out over a larger area all fell in the same place. And that increases the flood risk pretty significantly. The locations and timing of tropical cyclones, unfortunately, are something that we're not able to predict very far in advance. Weather models can only do this about a few days in advance. But there are these general trends that we can be aware of. Another sort of clue to when tropical cyclones may occur is this phenomena of El Nino and La Nina events. These are slow 6 to 12 month long events. So each year you only really get one of them or none of them. And that's something that we're able to predict quite far in advance. During a La Nina, you get colder temperatures along the eastern side of the Pacific and warmer temperatures along the west. And it's the opposite during El Nino. This actually can help us prepare for tropical cyclones because it shifts the locations where tropical cyclones are more probable. So in the lower picture, I'm showing you a map from a study that looked at tropical cyclones during El Niños and tropical cyclones during La Niñas. And the regions that are colored blue are more likely to have a tropical cyclone during a La Nina, whereas the regions that are red are more likely to have them during an El Nino. So you can imagine that once this is forecasted by maybe the Bureau of Meteorology, maybe NOAA in the US, you know that in the next few months, tropical cyclones are either more or less probable for you. And I know I've painted quite an alarming picture, but there are things we can do from there. So one example is preparing at that seasonal scale based on El Nino and La Nina. Another is updating infrastructure. Now, many engineers are probably familiar with the intensity frequency diagram that I'm showing on the right. So on the x-axis is how many, the return period of some event, you know, maybe a once in a 100-year flood. And on the y-axis is the intensity of that event. So here I'm showing wind speed of a tropical cyclone. The historical curve, which I'm showing in blue, has something that's about 70 meters per second occurring maybe every 60-ish years. But the projected future curve has that happening every 40 years. And this projected future curve is something that we're able to derive from future projections based on climate models. So one could then try to build infrastructure that is adapted to that instead of the old curve. This is an example of some work that my colleagues did in Vanuatu, where they suggested a few remediations to a small bungalow, and that's the before picture on the left. And after a tropical cyclone, we found that only the thatched roof part was damaged. So we can use these climate projections to guide our expectations of what might come next. So to wrap up, climate change does essentially 4 things for the Pacific. It makes heat waves worse. It increases rain rates, meaning that flash floods and landslides are more damaging. It increases sea level rise, and it intensifies tropical cyclones. But I hope I've left you with some thoughts about the things that we can do as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We If you've got questions, please don't forget that there's a Q&A section for the Zoom call. Please write your questions in there. Next up, I'd like to welcome Keith Bettinger. Keith, as I said, is based in the United States and is a climate specialist again. So, Keith, please, over to you.
Thank you, colleagues. I'm going to attempt to share my slides here. Okay, can you please let me know if you can see my slides?
Not yet. It's at the end. They're just coming up now, Keith. Yes. we can
Looks
see
good.
the slides. Thank you.
That's good. Okay, great. Welcome. Hello, everyone from the United States, where it's yesterday. We're living in the past over here. It's evening time on the 19th for me. Thanks for the great introduction, Dr. Nandini. Thanks for that outstanding presentation, which I think sets the stage for mine. Just very quickly about myself, my name is, as you know, is Keith Bettinger, and I'm a specialist in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. I work for a company called DAI, and our company specializes in implementing development projects for USAID, for UK aid, and for the EU. So in the United States, our aid agency works very similar to the way things work in Australia, where you have the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And when DFAT wants to implement a project in the Pacific or elsewhere, they bid that out to private sector companies like DT Global or formerly Cardno. My firm does work like that. Although we don't do any work with DFAT in the past, I have worked with firms on DFAT projects. And what I'd like to do, what my job is, I do technical work on projects around the world, but my home region is the Pacific, where I was based in Hawaii for a long time. I did my PhD in geography there. And so I have done a lot of work in the Pacifics and a lot in Vanuatu. And what I'd like to talk to you today about is a project that we're working on. It's temporarily on pause, but we're working on in Vanuatu to apply anticipatory action models for disaster risk reduction for slow onset hazards. So I'm going to explain what anticipatory action models are. That's the primary purpose of my presentation, and use Vanuatu as a case study for that. So we'll move on to the next slide. Very quickly, I want to go over to the disaster cycle here to set the stage for this. So when we talk about the disaster risk reduction, virtually everywhere we think about the disaster cycle or the disaster risk reduction cycle, and it has four primary stages. And again, this is a cycle, right? The first stage is mitigation, and these are actions that we take to prevent or reduce disaster risks. Examples include constructing levees for floods, purchasing insurance. These are examples of mitigation activities. Mitigation is usually accompanied by preparedness. So we get ready for disasters, for events that we cannot mitigate, that we can't prevent. So we get prepared. Now, mitigation and preparedness typically take place prior to the disaster event, prior to the calamity. And then following the disaster, we have two additional stages. We have response, and these are activities that you are probably familiar with: search and rescue, those types of things. These are actions delivering aid and relief. These are actions in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. And then after the response-based phase is finished, we work on recovery, which is rebuilding, reconstructing. And you see that I've included the term "build back better," which some of you probably have heard before. So there's a lot of learning of lessons in recovery. Now, in some cases, virtually all organizations use the disaster cycle. Sometimes you see an additional step put in there, but the concept is the same across organizations, across UN OCHA, across the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency, and most countries disaster management organizations or authorities use some form of the disaster cycle to organize and conceptualize their activities. So that's a disaster cycle. And why is this important? Well, I've selected this graphic here that you can see. This applies to the United States, but you will be able to see similar trends demonstrated in virtually any country around the world, any country or any region. And what I want to show here is we've got two trends that are taking place at the same time that are related to one another. The first is the increasing global average of temperature, global warming. And we can see on this graph here, 1980 to 2021. And at the same time, kind of in lockstep with that, since 1980, we've seen an increase in the United States and elsewhere in the number of billion-dollar disasters per year. They have increased significantly. Now, most of these billion-dollar disasters that we've seen, they are the increase is due to increasing hydrometeorological disasters. So cyclones, floods, wildfires. We see these on the news all the time. Australia has pretty significant experience with fires and flooding. And these have the expense of these, the harm that is done by these, has increased over time, not only because of the severity and the frequency of these events, but also because we tend to build things, make investments in places that are susceptible to disasters. So another thing that's important about this, so if we think back to the disaster cycle, remember we've got mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. We tend to spend a lot more money on response and recovery. It's just the way that our systems are set up. But there's increasing learning, increasing evidence from studies that demonstrate that investments in the front end of the disaster cycle, like in preparedness and mitigation, pay significant dividends on the response and recovery side. So the number that we usually use at UN OCHA, and US FEMA and USAID use, we typically say that for every dollar that you spend on preparedness and mitigation, you're saving $7 on response and recovery. Some studies say as high as $11. So it's smart. It makes sense to put more money and more effort into preparedness and mitigation. But again, we don't often do that. So that brings me to my next slide, which is about, this is just very quickly in the Pacific. From 2011, you can see here 1.7 billion in economic losses to our colleagues in the Pacific, 91 major disasters. The most frequent are storms, but that's followed by floods and drought. 5 million people affected. Almost everybody in the Pacific has been affected by some form of disaster or another over the past 10 years. So this brings us to the idea of the anticipatory action model, right? So within this disaster cycle, a new approach has emerged to reduce losses. And this is the AAM, the anticipatory action model. So the Red Cross defines an anticipatory action model as a set of actions taken to prevent or mitigate potential disaster impacts before a shock or acute impacts are felt. The actions are carried out in anticipation of a hazard impact and based on a prediction of how events will unfold. So in my graphics here, you can see the idea of an anticipatory action model. These are actions that are taken when the disaster is imminent, when you know that the catastrophe is going to happen. And the idea you can see on the left-hand side is to reduce the impact. Right? It's not to avoid the disaster, because at this point we can't avoid the disaster. We know it's coming. But we can reduce the impact. So when we look at the full-on disaster cycle, I think Peter is going to talk about this in the next presentation. Anticipatory action fits just right before the disaster, right before response. So it's a preparedness type of activity. But what differentiates it from preparedness is that the anticipatory action model is triggered. It's triggered by some form of early warning information that we have. So on our next slide here, we'll look at some of the key features of an anticipatory action model. 3. The first is a trigger, right? And this involves early warning. It involves some sort of threshold, and when the wind speed breaks this threshold, or when the soil moisture content breaks the threshold, or whatever indicator it is that you choose, then that triggers the action, right? So the triggers could be hard triggers. These are absolute triggers that are based on data, like a wind speed threshold. We can also have soft triggers, and the soft triggers are more kind of expert judgment, or we can merge these two things together. But the key thing about an anticipatory action model is that you have these triggers that have been pre-decided. And when the trigger is activated, that leads to actions that have already been agreed upon by everybody. There's standard operating procedures that have been put in place and thought out based on how people, places, and things experience a disaster event. Yeah? And so that's the second element. Our third element is financing. So typically when you're dealing with an anticipatory action model, there's some
All right. It looks
can
like
go
we have-
directly to people that are experiencing the disaster, or to partner agencies and so forth. So we've got triggers, actions, and financing. Now, with these anticipatory action models, one of the things that it precedes is a fairly high level of interagency cooperation, right? So typically in the Pacific, what we've seen is anticipatory actions, traction for cyclones, yeah, because we've made some pretty significant advances in our early warning capabilities with cyclones. But now we understand from in the Pacific that there's the potential to apply these to flooding and to droughts and other slow onset events. Now, cyclone is a sudden onset event, but some things like drought are slow onset. So in the Pacific, we can also draw on bottom-up community knowledge and practice, because in many places, in many contexts, there's a high level of environmental and ecological awareness in the Pacific. So next, our setting then is Vanuatu. Vanuatu is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to disasters and climate change. Depending on the source that you look at, it is often described as the most vulnerable. In fact, DFAT, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, put out a risk profile for Vanuatu just a couple of years ago and said that the country is at the highest risk of disasters worldwide. And this is a function of their very high levels of exposure to virtually every kind of hazard, except for snow-related hazards, right? But they've got everything else. They've got cyclones, they've got sea level rise, they've got geophysical, they've got flooding, but also the vulnerability, the lack of coping capacity, and the lack of adaptive capacity. So, for example, I think maybe all of us remember the tropical cyclone Pam, which is a Category 5 cyclone with estimated wind speeds at about 250 kilometers an hour. The total economic value, the total economic effects of Pam were about 450 million US dollars. That's something like 60% of the GDP. So also Vanuatu, until very recently, Vanuatu was least developed removed from being a least developed country. Cyclones are the biggest threat, the biggest hydrometeorological threat. There are other geophysical threats, as we've seen recently in the earthquake that struck Vanuatu in December, which I was actually there for. But in terms of hydrometeorological threats, drought is the second biggest threat. Vanuatu also has a Vanuatu Meteorological and Geophysical Department. Sorry, I got the letters mixed up here on this slide, which is responsible for the warning. So they have a fairly well-developed early warning mechanism, and they also have a strong system of custom or traditional ecological knowledge, traditional social organization. So in Vanuatu, AAMs are recently being introduced. So they're currently developing a system for anticipatory action models for cyclones, and this is being funded by the Australian Humanitarian Partnership. So being funded by the supported by the Australian government. It's being implemented by a number of partners, including Save the Children, Adventist Development Relief Agency, an organization and umbrella organization of local faith-based outfits, as well as Action Aid. And the way that this this anticipatory action model for cyclones works, they're still setting it up, but the trigger is the wind speed, right? So they have a readiness trigger, and then they have an action trigger. The readiness trigger is when there's a development of a low pressure system, as Nandini mentioned earlier, in the proximity of Vanuatu, and then the action trigger is when the winds reach the Category 3 threshold. So usually the idea is that you have 2 to 3 days of warning. And when that happens, when the threshold is passed, the partner organizations have a number of actions that they take, a number of the pre-positioning supplies and so forth. And then there's a financing mechanism that's being tested out. It's being put in place right now, in which local community climate change disaster committees receive credit from the Australian Humanitarian Partnership, and with that credit, they can go to local vendors after they've taken an inventory of their evacuation shelter, and they can pick up anything that they need and not have to worry about cash, right? So that's the financial transfer mechanism. So this is just getting started. UN OCHA is also working with the National Disaster Management Organization on a national level framework for AAMs. But what we're working on under our project is to expand this to drought. So as I mentioned earlier, drought is the second largest or second most severe hydrometeorological hazard in Vanuatu. They don't have an effective national drought monitoring system. They do issue warnings based on the standardized precipitation index, but the occurrence of drought is generally there's not a national system for it. It's reported most of the time through social media. So when you talk to government officials about drought in Vanuatu, they say, "Well, we learn about it from Facebook. We learn about it from WhatsApp on these, not remote islands, but islands that are far afield from Efate. And it's also difficult to respond to. So what we're working on until our recent pause is identifying how we can implement how we can adapt anticipatory action models to drought in Vanuatu. So our next steps, what we'll do is we're working to identify 3 sites with the Department of Water Resources. And originally we thought that we might do these sites up in the Torres Islands, up in the far north of Vanuatu, but it's prohibitively expensive to get to these places. There's also a GCF, a Green Climate Fund project, that's working on water security now. So in our initial consultations with the Department of Water Resources, we understood that there are some communities and small islands close to Efate that definitely need this. That don't have any, their lens is getting increasingly salinated, and they don't have any. They're having problems with water security. So once we identified these 3 sites, then what we want to do is we want to recruit 3 local NGOs through the Vanuatu Association of NGOs to actually do the work on the ground. And the work on the ground includes, bringing the communities on board very early in the process to ensure that they understand what's going on and how an anticipatory action model can benefit them.
You got 2 minutes, Keith.
Going on and to have ownership, to lead the way. So part of this process involves understanding, working with the communities, developing the partnerships, and then we will work also to develop a GEDC analysis, gender equity, disability, and social inclusion. We've got a local organization, the Vanuatu Society for Persons with Disabilities. They disability audits to understand how different groups of people experience drought, and these differential vulnerabilities associated with drought. Then following that, we'll work on the triggers, and the idea here is that we'll combine the top-down information from VMGD, Vanuatu Meteorological and Geophysical Department, with bottom-up information and knowledge from the community, from the custom system. The problem with VMGD's drought warnings is that they're not at the spatial resolution that's needed. So on one side of the island, for example, you may have plentiful rainfall because of the leeward-windward dynamic, whereas on the other side of the island, you don't have any rain at all, and you have drought conditions. And the mechanisms that they have for drought tracking right now do not have that local scale resolution that's needed. And so we need to combine that with this bottom-up information. And then their next step after that will be identifying the actions that the community and other partners can take when the trigger is triggered, when it's activated. And this includes locally appropriate technology. So we've had some initial consultations with Engineers Without Borders. And the idea here would be to have Engineers Without Borders conduct some sort of study in these communities to understand what kinds of locally appropriate technology we can apply. And then we establish the financing relationships, which probably involves tapping into OCHA's Anticipatory Action Model Fund. And once we have all of this set up, its process probably will take about 18 months. We test it, we learn, and then we scale it nationally, right? And then also the idea would be the findings would feed into the National Framework for Infrastructure Investment Planning. So that's very briefly what anticipatory action models are and how we're attempting to apply them in Vanuatu. Under our original time frame, we're supposed to be further along than we are. But I think that everyone probably in the audience understands the current political exigencies in the United States that have conspired to put us behind schedule a little bit on this. But I look forward to answering any questions or hearing any comments. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was extremely interesting, and you did very well. You actually dropped out a couple of times on the link, but it was absolutely fine. There was no great problems at all. I hope the audience enjoyed it. Without any further ado, Peter, over to you, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Paul. All right, so I'll need to move pretty quickly just to see if we can make some time at the end for some questions. So I think everybody's aware my name is Peter Self. I sort of work for two companies, but that's not really the case. EWS owns Broadwick Connect. I may get a moment to share the reason why we've got two companies running in one, but for the moment, first of all, I just want to, I guess, acknowledge the presentations that have come through already. I'm always fascinated in these sorts of environments with the sort of level of development and progress that's being made in sort of all sectors of the early warning system program that's underway. My talk right now is really centered around an issue, my point of view, which is that the dissemination and communication layer of early warning systems is lagging terribly behind most other components in innovation and what's being developed, and in particular, the technology and development of technology that supports that function. To put some, if you like, context, what we've been covering throughout the course of the session today, the webinar, is basically moving through the key elements of a multi-hazard early warning system. So if we start with the blue circle in the top right, it's observation, monitoring, forecasting, predictive capability, and moving to the next key pillar, which is knowledge and knowledge bases and understanding risk in various levels. And that sort of topic has been covered. And then moving through to preparedness and response capabilities. And then finally to what our focus, or my focus in my company and the rest of this discussion is on, which is around the warning dissemination and communication component or aspect of an early warning system. So that's this view, or this model is, I've stolen it from the World Health Organization. it's a fairly well recognised model globally for how to understand the different components of a warning system. It's also worth noting that the context that it plays out in is a before, during and after context, and it can be a bit of a misdirect to say early warning system, because they really are designed for the program of recovery as well as straight warnings. For our part, the expertise that Broadband Connect brings to this conversation, our expertise is around geospatial radio technology, which is in the form of FM, VHF and UHF, and its broadcast technology. We've come upon this problem as part of our journey through our technology evolution. Originally, we were working on smarter warning technology. That has been deployed in mission critical environments and has led us to communicating, by very nature of what we do is broadcast, to mass communication. And we've been drawn then into work that relates to public safety communication for disasters, and that's the mass communication side of that. What I have found very surprising is how big that gap is. And when I refer to a lack of innovation, we on a daily basis use location information. So I know when I've got transport arriving. I know when I've got food that I've ordered is going to arrive. I know where my children are over the weekend. I can see them driving in cars. I even track our pets with tags. And you'd ask the question, why don't we have that same technology currently applied in the context of disasters? And it points to a really critical problem, and that problem is simply that damage to power grids and cell towers during disasters disrupts communication, and it makes it basically impossible for those sorts of technologies to be deployed in context, and in my view is creating a blockage to innovation. And that blockage, I think, is selling us short as what's possible in the environment. And one of the things I'm hoping to achieve in talking to a group such as this is to draw attention, if you like, to the problem, because it's very much our focus every day in what we're trying to solve. What I've got here now is just an example of what the type of impact, if you like, that we see. And there's many examples of it. And the question here was whether I provide an example that's relevant to the Pacific region, or I use this one, which is one I've developed recently. And I think the point of this is that there is if you like, a misunderstanding or a misconception that the problem of disaster and failed communication infrastructure is really developed countries. It was a great surprise to me to see the extent of the impact that is experienced the hurricanes in September last year in the US. It absolutely shocked me when I dug into the Federal Communications Commission website and pulled out the reports that 4,500 cell towers were knocked out of action, half a dozen TV stations, and nearly 50 radio stations through the result of that hurricane or that storm front that came through. There were fatalities in the US. So this misconception that it is a developing country issue, I think, is a real problem. What is true is that it is typically the more vulnerable of communities in those places that experience the impact more so than others, but it's not restricted to developing countries. If we dig a little bit deeper, I was always interested by, well, how does that actually play out in the context of, kind of on the ground? What does it look like? We don't have a lot of time, so I've just got a really quick summary. There is in North Carolina, there was a particular county called Buncombe County where there was a very high rate of fatality as a result of Hurricane Helene. There was extensive cell tower outage, and there was widespread reports that warnings were issued and failed. I dug into that to get a better understanding of actually what happened. And there was a number of evacuation centres in preparation that had opened up. They filled up very quickly, and they opened up two additional emergency evacuation centres on the Thursday prior to the impact on the Friday 28th, when that made it through to Buncombe County. A lot of those, or 3 out of those 4 evacuation centres, lost power. They lost power in the afternoon on the Thursday. On Friday morning, the one and only single evacuation order was issued. It was issued at 6:30 a.m. As we can see, power had already gone out in much of the county, which meant that a lot of the messages recipients of messages didn't receive them. By that afternoon, so within 10 hours of a mandatory evacuation order being issued, they had a flood peak 6 metres higher than they'd ever recorded before. And that all swept through the county in extraordinarily fast time. And what we saw also within that then is, with evacuation centres not having power and also filling up and reaching capacity, there's a lot of challenge in directing where people need to head in the face of disaster, and really no capacity to manage all of that. What I want to talk about now is the possibility that if we did have resilient communication infrastructure and we could connect people, we would be able to provide real-time visibility, and it would fundamentally change everything in the way that we operate by using closed-loop communications. Currently, all forms of warning dissemination and communication are effectively an open loop. So it's SMS. I do a lot of work in the Philippines. It is Facebook pages. It is people driving around in cars with loudspeakers. There's no closed loop communication. There's no ability to get feedback or insights about whether communications have been effective and whether people have taken action according to what the warnings were. What I've got here is a view about what we could do if we had the capacity to make observation and track people's movements before, during, and after the impact of disasters. In the before context, it would give the capacity to be able to assess population risk and exposure. The information that comes out of knowledge bases, predictive capability in systems would be able to be used to provide a measure of population density and risk exposure with particular impact zones, the capacity to evacuate vulnerable populations or members of the community early. During disasters, the capacity to provide not only just evacuation warnings, but in the Buncombe County example, there was many examples where people suffered injury because they actually tried to evacuate when they should have remained where they were. That information is all very geographically based. So to be able to provide warnings based on geography and specific locations during storms is quite critical. Load balancing of evacuation centre is an issue in all parts of the world. And when we are able to provide real-time data on capacity, we can then direct people correctly to where they need to go. And then even post-disasters, the allocation of resources, where people are, prioritise more vulnerable people wherever they're located, to provide geofencing around hazards that now occur to prevent people from going into areas that are dangerous, and intelligently route populations once we have an understanding and we're unpacking and working through the issues that have been presented by any given disaster. I point to this because, in my view, this is the sort of vision that we should be striving for in the world of disaster management. The unfortunate challenge we have is that the infrastructure that is in place in most parts of the world limit that capacity. And I guess I've moved quickly because of time to allow some time for questions, Paul, but I thought I would pose, to start a conversation, if there was time for that, was really am I missing something in this? When I have not been able to find any consequential work that's focused on resilience of infrastructure. There seems to be, on a worldwide basis, an acceptance that it just is what it is. So I would ask, is there enough focus on building resilient infrastructure? What discussions happening around technology options? We bring a particular option to the table, but I'm sure it's not the only option. Will market forces fill this gap, or is it up to governments and others to promote and provide support and development in the area of infrastructure resilience? Are the sorts of questions that I actually grapple with on a daily basis. And yeah, like I'm interested if there's a response from the audience either before, and I have provided my details here if anybody is interested in picking up conversations at a later stage outside this forum. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Paul, in as quick time as I could get through.
Rita, you did an outstanding job. Thank you very, very much for that. Do you think you might be able to put your, I think, second slide back up and just leave it there for a little while, if you would? Because it provides an excellent summary, really, of what we've had through the course of this webinar. And so I'd like to really thank Dr. Nandini, Keith, and yourself for all of the work that you've done to prepare and for your time that you've given. Now, there's 3 questions in the box at the moment. What I'd like to do is thank Rachel first of all for the 2 of them, and ask Dr. Nandini to address the first question, which is regarding downscale climate models that are crucial for understanding the climate impacts in the Pacific countries. There's a lot more words in there, but Nandini, I believe you may have read those. Are you able to respond to that at all?
Yes. Just very quickly for context, downscaled models are when we take those large global climate models, they are at a very low spatial resolution. So one grid box on that might be 200 kilometers across. And when it comes to small island nations, that type of resolution is just not at all sufficient to make actionable information out of that. So downscaled models are either weather models that are put into that information or statistical models that take that as input and make some sort of prediction. So in doing that, we do integrate an analysis of the climate models that perform best at simulating the phenomena relevant to the Pacific region before we put in a downscaled model. So there are about roughly 40 to 50 climate models from around the world, and we picked just the top 6 that perform the best for that region. And then we put maybe a weather model or an AI model. And Rachel's question was about how we further tailor this to the countries we work with. So in addition to that physical science tailoring that we do, we also work closely with behavioral scientists in the CSIRO. So we actually go out to the country in question and meet with government officials, meet with local communities, run interviews, try to get a really good picture of who holds the information in that setting, who makes the decisions, and who communicates the decisions, and figure out what targeted interventions could help out with the whole process. So recently we had a project where we were working on the food system in Samoa, and we were trying to make a digital tool. So we even had a UX designer come out with us and test our interface in that cultural context and with the technologies they had available there. So I would say the sort of critical thing in adapting things to a particular setting is being very interdisciplinary about it, making sure you have the experts in all sorts of things, whether that's physics or sociology or design. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Nandini. Keith, do you have anything to add in regards to this question?
No, I think that Nandini pretty much covered it all. Like for me, in terms of the work that we do, it's the resolution problem that is that you mentioned that is the biggest thing. Or, you know, a lot of models just don't perform very well with complex topography, right?
Yeah.
So for example, in Hawaii, you know, if you I have worked with both the statistical and the dynamical downscaling teams that are doing the rainfall projections for Hawaii, but they're divergent, right? They give you different returns. So I for me that's the big issue, the resolution. I have always thought with downscaled models, I'm always leery of the illusion of precision, right, and certainty. And so the levels of certainty that you have in certain circumstances, I'm not pointing to any in particular, are just not, they don't comport very well with the level of certainty that decision makers demand, right? And so if, you know, if you're in the scientific community and you're talking about a level where 80% certain about something, we're 75% certain about something, well, to a scientist, that's a high level of certainty. But for a decision, you know, political decision maker, it's not, they want higher levels than that. So there's kind of this accountability trap in between what the decision makers demand and what, you know, science can provide. And that's not anybody's fault, but it's a difficult thing to deal with. But yeah, that's my take on that. Over.
No troubles at all. Dr. Nandini, can I ask you now to have a look at the next question that Rachel's put up in regards to better integrating Indigenous knowledge with scientific forecasting? And other than finance, what are the key challenges in implementing such an approach across the Pacific?
So that's a great question. Thanks, Rachel, for that. So there's a couple of ways to look at this for me. One is to understand that, you know, across the Pacific, anybody who's worked there understands that there's an institutional grain, right? There are structures and mechanisms of local level organization, and it's highly localized and it's variable in a lot of places, like in Vanuatu or the Solomon Islands. In Fiji, there's a lot of local variation, but the first thing that I would say is that when you're going into a situation like this, you have to go in with your eyes and your ears open and understand what is already there in terms of the institutional grain. And when you're trying to develop a system, for example, in Vanuatu with these community disaster and climate change committees that they're working to set up across the country, well, you go with the institutional grain, right? So it's very interesting in Vanuatu that the Disaster Act, the National Disaster Act, Disaster Management Act, it mandates that each community in Vanuatu should have one of these CDCCCs, a Community Disaster and Climate Change Committee, but it does not mandate what the composition of those committees should be, right? What they should look like. So it opens a door intentionally for the communities to do this in their own way. So I think the first thing is that we have to recognize that there's already things in place. There are already relationships, community relationships, resource management practices, and then we have to work through those rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. The second thing is to understand that, well, you know, people in the Pacific have been observing the environment for thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of years, and have a fairly good understanding of natural variability and patterns and so forth. I do not think that that's a catch-all, right? I don't think that's a panacea. But what we do have to recognize is that, well, when we're dealing with these resolution issues like Nandini was mentioning, or if we have a leeward-windward island dynamic where your rainfall projections are just one big block, right? Whereas you have a lot of topographical variability within that block, and that block is just not giving you the local level resolution that you need for rainfall, that we can really augment that with some local level observations and traditional traditional knowledge types of things that are the equivalent to observing the soil moisture, right? Or understand, the variations in other environmental variables and incorporating those into our systems. So Vanuatu has done a very good job at documenting indigenous indicators for phenological cycles and for all sorts of things. It's really fascinating, and they have prioritized research in this area. There's a lot of work to be done, but they have it's enshrined in their constitution and in their climate change laws and all of this kind of thing. So they've done a good job there. But just to recap, we have to work with the institutional grain. That's number one. And number two, understand how, existing knowledge systems and observations can be this bottom-up element and join with the top-down, things that you get out of like the National Disaster Management Organization and so forth. Over.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Dr. Nandini, do you have anything to add in regard to this aspect of Indigenous information? Is that considered in your studies?
So that is something that we consider in some of our projects. I will second Keith in saying that it can be very heterogeneous across the region. Different countries and even different islands within the same country will have different traditions around their indigenous knowledge and indicators. Often the challenge is that this is, unlike in Vanuatu, this is not always something that's well documented when you go in and talk to people. So it's, there is this whole social science aspect of it that needs to occur in parallel with the physical science part. And I would also add that Keith was made a very good point about the uncertainty that climate projections come with. And uncertainty is just not an intuitive concept for humans in general. And how to think about uncertainty often, people just react to it by saying, I don't want this uncertainty range, I just want a number. But one way of communicating what's going on with the science to produce that uncertainty is to make analogies to indigenous knowledge. Like sometimes they know intuitively what to do if one indicator is telling them one thing and another indicator is telling them another thing. And you can frame the uncertainties in the science in a similar way so that it's something that's a familiar scenario. So indigenous knowledge can also be used in some ways to help support explaining those uncertainties that come with the science.
And thank you, Doctor. And Peter, not to be forgotten, Peter, this is a related type of question. It relates to the translation of messages into local languages. So when we're talking about emergency warning, is this given consideration for you?
Yeah, so that's not to get into my system specifically, but it's really important. We use voice messaging rather than text because voice messaging is on the whole much more effective in terms of how people respond. And in that, then we provide language translation services for that. That's one of the things that is fairly straightforward in today's modern world, is to issue in multiple languages. And I think also that's part of the program of being able to break out the community into segments that have got different requirements and needs. And then language is clearly one of them. And also it can run deeper than that as well, because when you're actually messaging to a population, aside from language and making sure that what you're sending through is understood, there's another layer to that, which is that there's a different level of response throughout the community. If you want to simplify it, the stayers and the leavers and there is a lot of people that will choose to remain in place during disasters despite mandatory evacuations. There's others with the inclination to leave early, understanding not just from a language perspective, but being able to measure what you're putting forward. I think this is the innovation that I think is a really big opportunity in time, is to be able to better message into audiences, not just based on language, but the segmented view. So who during a crisis would respond at what stage? And then to my point about being able to get visibility of whether they've responded, to watch who's still in place, so we can count in real time movement and watch and see the result of what's going on. So language is certainly a good introduction into, but there's layers within that as well.
Absolutely, no worries. So look, thank you for that, and thank you, Rachel, for all your questions. But we also have a question in from Jamie, and it's again for you, Peter. You mentioned UHF, VHF communication and one-way comms or broadcast. What about satellite technology?
Yes. So I look at the technology layer of things. It's a team game. So disaster response is a team game, and certainly satellite plays a role in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's a reliable form of communication for, like, if you like, a data link. It's very costly to provide lots of data links that are resilient and to be able to then access broad parts of communities. So there's a cost layer to providing that. We certainly in our solutions use satellite to provide connectivity between locations and to be backhaul data to central areas of command, particularly the concept of a national system. That's absolutely necessary. Then the other layer is what's coming through is for direct to cell. So basically being able to communicate from satellites to mobile phones. And that has a really important role to play in low density population areas where coverage is not good at the moment. It starts to struggle when we see higher densities and the capacity issues coming about. That's much more difficult because simply the capacity of satellite networks to provide intense communications in areas where there's a lot of people. And that's often where, we find there's plenty of examples where infrastructure hasn't failed in the sense of it's fully powered and at full capacity, but reaches capacity. So in a good example, a little bit of a while back, but in Melbourne, we had the Maribyrnong River flooded, and there was a whole lot of concern post the event because SMS messages didn't get through. It was purely capacity issues on what is effectively a terrestrial network. When you put that in the context of satellite, it has some challenges in high density areas.
Thank you for that, Peter. And I will also take up what Jamie was talking about insofar as during the Tongan eruption, the first services up were actually provided by satellite, and there was a huge role in particular for the low Earth orbit solutions that now exist, and I believe really should be examined very, very carefully, both from the aspect that their ground segment is very small and mobile, and secondly that to the handset, and satellite to the handset is becoming significantly more available, especially at the SMS type layers. So great question, Jamie. Now there's no more questions in the list, but if anybody out there has another question, please don't hesitate to add it in. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask Dr. Nandini, on one of your slides, you indicated that the Northeast Pacific area, in particular, the graph showed there was going to be a lot more cyclonic activity in that area. And then when you looked at the other graphs, it appeared more around the equatorial area. Can you help understand why there could be more activity in that part of the world?
So the likelihood of tropical cyclone formation,
Yeah.
it depends on a few things. One is how warm the underlying water is. So warmer water favors both more tropical cyclone formation and intensification. So that's one part of it. So some of that forecast is coming from where the warmest waters are going to be. Another important aspect, which is a little more difficult to predict and kind of provides that uncertainty that you saw, is the vertical shear. So in the atmosphere, if you have winds at a lower level going in one direction and winds at an upper level going in the opposite direction, you develop shear between those levels of the atmosphere. And that tends to break up storms and prevent them from forming. So you don't get these coherent moving structures when that type of setting is present. And how that will change is significantly more uncertain. So that while we're able to simulate how the winds will change to some degree, it is simulated with substantially less certainty than surface temperatures. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. It does. Now, I'd like to ask Keith a question. I'd just like to ask Keith. Keith, you were over in Vanuatu during the earthquake. Can you just give us just a little minute to explain to us how that felt as being in a developing country when that type of activity was there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the 7.3 earthquake, the focus was, I think it was about 20 kilometers due west of Port Vila, out in the water. And I think that the movement was a thrust movement. So I've been in earthquakes before. I've worked in Japan and in Indonesia and lived in Hawaii for a long time. But this was and so when an earthquake happens, any colleagues from New Zealand definitely know this. You know it immediately when it's happening because the compressional waves reach you first, so primary waves. And then I was working on in the hotel, the largest building in Vanuatu at the time, and the building started to shake like a paint mixer. It was quite frightening. I was surprised that the building actually maintained its integrity. It stood up. So it seemed like it lasted for a long time, but when it finally ended, I left, and we had internet for about 5 minutes after the earthquake before everything went dark. So I checked the United States Geological Survey, the USGS, because I wanted to know where the earthquake was, and it was very close. And so I immediately thought about a tsunami, but it was so close that the tsunami would have hit us almost immediately if there turned out to be about a 10-inch tsunami. So there was one, but it didn't do any damage. But then I started to try to, because all communications went down, I tried to figure out what to do. And I made my way very quickly up to the Australian High Commission. It happened to be very close to the hotel, and they didn't have any communications there. So I made my way to the U.S. Embassy, and it had been destroyed. And along the way, I saw some buildings were pancaked, and I understand rescue crews. I understand very quickly that it was a serious situation in Vanuatu. Once after the first few hours, we were able to identify a Starlink. So this is relevant to one of the previous questions. Starlink really was a game changer in this situation because the undersea cable was damaged. Nobody had any communications. Our only connection to the outside world was through Starlink. It was very useful. But once that happened, I was in Vanuatu for 5 or 6 days after that because of the flights. They shut down. And I turned it into kind of being a disaster person I turned it into a learning experience and just observed how the different agencies had tried to interact with one another, the lack of coordination. Vanuatu is not very well prepared for this earthquake. It was the largest earthquake they ever had. So I was trying to understand and observe how, the Ni Vanuatu experienced this, but also how the government reacted to it and all the things that took place. There were a lot of mass movements, right? Vanuatu has complex topography, and I was just astonished at the number of landslides that were triggered by this. And if people understand the geomorphology and the geology of tropical islands, you understand that there's a lot of like unconsolidated, heavily weathered material, right, that lends itself to landslides. So I began to worry about that because we were going into the rainy season, and rain, just saturating the soil and causing more landslides. And so for me, it was just it was a learning experience after the immediate, the immediate precariousness passed. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Keith. That's
Sure.
thank you for sharing, and it's something that I think many of us really feel that the risk to human life, the personal loss from disasters. I mean, with the work that you're doing on anticipatory action, we've got early warning system and our wonderful research people. I thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to pass back to Dick if he'd like to close us out.
Yes, thank you, Paul, and I echo your comments there. This has been a first-class presentation. But before I close, I'll just mention a couple of the events coming up via the hub. We have the Humanitarian Innovation Awards 2025, which will feature our hackathon mid-year. We've been doing this for 6 years now, and it is open to all undergraduates from Australian and Pacific Island universities. We had 28 universities represented last year, and it will be on the 18th and 20th of July. I commend it to all undergraduates who happen to be on this webinar. Join in and join the unique experience and the excitement. We'll launch that hackathon on the 19th of March with a webinar. We'll be publicising that. There's also a pitch competition for postgraduates, and the first prize for that is the opportunity to present at the very large PTC conference, probably 7,000 delegates at that conference in Honolulu. So if you win that, well, you can get your surfboard and head off. The Hub's next webinar will be in May on the engagement of communities of local communities in development projects. Finally, let me thank Paul for his excellent control of this webinar. It's gone very well. I believe the audience will agree with me that it's been a first-class presentation on what is a key to making people safe, or certainly safer, in Pacific Island communities. And we will continue our work in this field, and you'll hear more about that. And finally, just to acknowledge our Hub General Manager and TECO expert, John Donahue, who is behind the scenes making everything work, and in particular bringing Keith in from wherever he is in the US. So thank you again, and I thank the audience and wish you well for the rest of the day, and declare this webinar closed. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.